Well, first, let me thank Claire, thank Ben, and the whole Center for Security Policy staff. It's my first time speaking at the lunch, and it's a pleasure to be with you. And also, thank you to all of you. I know it's not the warmest day of the year to be huddled here in Congress, but I'm glad you made it. I want to make just one quick little audible. So I just read this letter for the first time, and I have to applaud you for it. And there's actually a very important note in here that I just want to highlight because it relates to what I'm going to talk about and also relates to a lot of the work I've done, more of a Latin America specialist, if you want to call it that, a little more focused on the Western Hemisphere. And on page 3 of the letter, it mentions, I think it's the 4th paragraph down, it mentions the air base of Manta in Ecuador. This is a very important precedent, I think, that we could take to look at what could potentially happen with Guantanamo or Gitmo, and specifically if it was to be shut down. Manta was a forward operating base for our U.S. forces and the primary access point to all interception of maritime interdiction operations on the Pacific. So we had multi-ton seizures of drugs that would come in there. I used to serve in the Marine Corps, so I'd spent some time in Manta on some of these operations. When it shut down because of a political spat between our president at the time, Barack Obama, and the president of Ecuador, who's a Chavez-like figure named Rafael Correa, when that base shut down, in the 5 years since that base shut down in 2009, it is now the access point of not of stopping drugs, but of shipping drugs all throughout the Pacific through Honduras into the United States. So this is a very interesting precedent of how a lack of foresight and policy, what might not have seemed like a strategic point, or maybe saying, okay, we lose the base in Manta, who cares, has turned into a big headache for U.S. national security. Gitmo could be 10 times worse. But anyways, that's just a little side note because I'm here to talk about Argentina. What I'm going to try to do for you today is answer 2 questions, and this is what Ben asked me to talk about. I wrote a lot about Iran and Latin America. I knew Dr. Nisman through my work. I'd be happy to talk to you more about his case and maybe just a little bit about the Iranian portfolio, perhaps in the Q&A or in other discussions. But I want to answer 2 questions for you, which is related to Argentina. The first is, according to the title, why are we losing Argentina? Like what conditions exist in the country and what's prevalent throughout the region that we're actually losing what once was a pretty strong historic U.S. ally? The second question is, what implications does losing Argentina have for U.S. national security? And all this is within the context of what I'm sure everyone knows, the death of Dr. Alberto Nisman, which I think symbolizes, or at least it represents, a growing concern by the U.S. and also within Argentina, within certain circles, that Argentina has swayed gradually into the geopolitical orbit of some of the most anti-U.S. actors around the world. I'm talking namely of Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, Russia, and China. In recent years, the current president, particularly Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, has really made this a big objective of her foreign policy. And I'd say the 2 prevailing reasons that she's done this is, one part ideology, and the other part just necessity. So I'm going to unpack that a little bit, and let's start with the ideology. For those that don't have or don't know much about Argentine history, I don't pretend to be an Argentine scholar, but I do know a little bit about the history in the country. Argentina, I like to look at it as sort of like an intellectual hub of radical ideas all throughout Latin America. Really, I mean, you got to remember one of the most prevalent anti-U.S. figures in the history of the world, and especially in Latin America, was Che Guevara, Ernesto Guevara, who is Argentinian. He represents a lot of what I think exists in Argentina for more than a century, which is just radical extremist ideologies that go from, neo-Nazi far-right ideologies that existed in groups like the Cara Pintadas, the Painted Faces. It's a group that used to exist in Argentina, not too prevalent anymore. Of course, there's the Peronists from back in the day, other far-left socialist groups like the Montoneros, which is where the Kirchners actually come from. And then you have groups that don't claim to have an ideology, but are just anti-U.S. for what they say. But they don't claim to be far right or far left, socialist or capitalist, but they're the quebrachos, which are basically a revolutionary nationalist movement that, in their words, say that they stand against the world imperialism of capitalism, which has become a prevailing theme in Argentina. So what you have here is quite an eclectic mix of different just radical ideas that I think was one of the major exports of Argentina, frankly, especially now that their economy is not doing so well. This had such an impact in the region that a figure that I'm sure everyone knows, the former late president of Venezuela, the caudillo Hugo Chavez, his academic formation and his intellectual inspiration came from a prominent Argentine academic named Alberto Nisman. So in the 90s, as Chavez began, remember Hugo Chavez was a military officer. Most of his formation came from the military. He wasn't quite of an academic or a political strategist. In the 90s, he started to get that formation and that training. And his mentor was an Argentine radical who used to talk about the anti-U.S. and not just anti-U.S., but actually particularly anti-Jewish. And a lot of Hugo Chavez sentiments that turn out to be anti-Jewish or anti-Israel came from Alberto Nisman. But all these radical groups that I'm describing that exist and permeated in Argentina, they kind of went underground for a good part of the 20th century, mostly because Argentina was under a military dictatorship. So during this dictatorship, which was a repressive time in Argentina, it was called the junta, a lot of these groups actually had to flee or just went underground and didn't have much access to power in the country. When Argentina shifted into a democracy during the 80s and into the 90s, they struggled like a lot of Latin American countries did with structural reforms in their economy, with just political processes. They dubbed this term in Latin America the lost decade because a lot of things didn't happen. It was kind of just stagnated for most part. In some cases, things went downhill. But what you see here is you see all these groups, because they weren't as prevalent in Argentina, they started to become more prevalent in the near abroad, mainly in the surrounding countries of Peru, Chile, Bolivia, Brazil, and spreading up northward all the way to Mexico, and in some cases going out to Africa and in the Middle East. This is going to be an important point for when I get to what exists in Argentina today. But the key point here really is that these radical ideologies have always existed in Argentina. They've been around for 100 years. I mean, the Peronists are very prevalent, Juan and Evita Perón from back in the early 20th century. And that's just grown and multiplied over time. And now in Argentina, since at least 2003, these groups, many of these individuals that belong to these groups hold positions of power within the government. So that's a little bit of the ideology. Let me talk a little bit about necessity. So since 2003, Argentina had a big economic dilemma in 2001 when they defaulted on their debt, their sovereign debt. They defaulted on their debt, and this created a rise of a populist movement, which is now in charge of the country. This is the Kirchners. First, it was Nestor Kirchner in 2003 who rose to power and prominence. And he placed a lot of these individuals from the Quebrachos, from the old Peronists and now Montoneros. He put them into cabinet-level positions in charge of new ministries like Ministry of Habitat and Ministry of Land, or old ministries such as important ministries like Defense and the Interior and others. So he created basically a power structure around him with people that already have very radical thinking, anti-U.S. thinking, and started to make reforms in the economy. These reforms did not go well, to say the least. Argentina today is facing a dual crisis at the minimum, perhaps more, on the economic side. They're facing an energy crisis, which is very interesting because Argentina used to be a net energy exporter because they have quite an abundance of hydrocarbons and other energy resources in their country. Then now they're an energy importer. Energy importer that's completely non-diversified. 90% of their energy sources come from oil and gas, meaning that they depend on oil in order for the lights to stay on in Argentina. Enter Hugo Chavez of Venezuela. Hugo Chavez understood, like many countries in Latin America that depend on oil and gas, understood that this gave him an inordinate amount of leverage to be able to sway the domestic policy and also the foreign policy of certain countries, Argentina being quite in his sphere of influence. Hugo Chavez, who had worked with the Kirchners all the way back to the campaign, had financed parts of their campaign, had become a prominent actor in the Kirchner rise to power, decided to buy about $10 billion of Argentine debt, as well as start to heavily send exports, send subsidized oil, heavily subsidized oil to Argentina so that they could fill in their energy deficit. So this is part of the necessity where Argentina really no longer can actually afford to say no to people, even if they wanted to, because they actually need this more than ever. This is compounded with just a massive social spending program, much like other countries in Latin America, Venezuela being one, Bolivia and others, where you have the spending going through the roof, so you have to inflate, and you have to take money from your cash reserves. The foreign reserve crisis, there's been about a 20 $20 to $25 billion drop in foreign reserves in the last 4 years in Argentina, which has led to a currency crisis where the exchange rates are enormous. Like if anyone travels to Argentina, I highly advise you not to change your dollars for pesos at any formal currency house or a hotel or airport or anything, because you'll get robbed, because there's about a 7-to-1 discrepancy in the exchange rate. So this creates an informal market for exchanges that they call the dollar blue, the blue dollar. That's where most people get access to cash, to dollars. So this makes the Argentine government strapped for dollars, strapped for cash, and again, makes them vulnerable to extra-regional or regional actors that want to give them this kind of support, but with conditions. So that's just a little bit of the context of some of the history of Argentina very briefly, just so you understand that this isn't something that happened overnight. This is something that's been taking gradually place over a period of several years, and particularly the last decade, where Argentina has really gone into a tailspin economically that's pushed them into the lenses of some of the actors we're talking about here. Argentina is now in a position where they're in a peculiar position where they can't choose necessarily who they want to work with. As the old adage goes, they have to go to the dance with those that are willing to dance with them. And right now, the actors that are willing to dance with them are the actors that I mentioned, the Venezuelas of the world, Russia, Iran, and China. Now, these countries understand Argentina's vulnerability, and they're willing to exploit it to the extent that the Kirchners are willing to let them. Let's start a little bit with Russia and China, and then I'll end with Iran, because I want to get into how this ties with Dr. Nisman and his work. Russia, for instance, had begun working in Argentina right at the turn of the century during the rise of Nestor Kirchner, and really started to become more heavy under the presidency of Cristina. Just this last year, and this is a lot of this stuff is really coming to light in the attention of the Argentine press and the public really in the last year, because in July of 2014, there was major meetings taking place between Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping from China, and the president of Argentina, Cristina Kirchner, to sign strategic accords and agreements to change the strategic landscape of the country. Obviously, this was also the time of the World Cup in Brazil, so they used that as a pretext to come down to the country, support their national teams down in Brazil, and then take a side trip to Argentina and sign a bunch of very interesting and not well understood accords. In the case of Russia, they signed satellite and nuclear energy agreements. So Argentina is one of 2 nuclear powers in Latin America, Brazil being the other one, and Argentina is actually one of the countries that has probably one of the most capacity for nuclear training. There's a center down in Bariloche, which is in the northeastern part of Argentina, that was used back in the 70s and 80s as an international hub for nuclear training. Has diminished quite a bit over time, but now is being re-stood up with the financing of Russia and China. There's Russian scientists now being sent there to help develop them on nuclear capability. Just so you know, the Bolivarian countries, the ALBA countries, Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, Nicaragua, all have nuclear programs. Some are more advanced than others. Some are in their infancy stages. I say they're all in their infancy stages, but some are definitely putting more money and attention to it. I think special attention should be paid to Bolivia's. You know, they signed these agreements. They're still coming to fruition as far as being implemented, but the initial deposits have been made. And in the meantime, you're just seeing an influx of Russian hardware, arms trades, and other coming into the country. To the point that I think there's even rumors now that Russia might try to create a military outpost in the southern part of Argentina. Enter China. China, during the same visit, or at least the same month, Xi Jinping also signed an agreement with Argentina on the nuclear front, but also since China has a lot more cash, gave Argentina a highly needed $11 billion loan that included a lot of, it was an accord that included a lot of annexes that haven't been revealed to the Argentine Congress, which is a big point of contention today. One of the major accords was to create a space station down in Argentina, and this very highly irregular space station, because they give them an inordinate amount of land, about 200 hectares down in Patagonia, which is in the southern part of Argentina, which overlaps with the same place where the Russians are doing their work to potentially build an outpost. Also recently, I don't know if anyone saw this in the news, but they sold them a bunch of fighter jets as well to Argentina that brought the British to quite alert, because, you know, this is very close to the Falkland, the Malvina Islands, and they're always worried that Argentina, although they have a big bark, they're always worried that they may at some point bite. The point of this is, and I have a diagram that I will pass to everybody, And this kind of broadens to the work that we do here at my center and with a lot of colleagues such as Center for Security Policy and others. But we have kind of a threat spectrum as we look at, because Latin America, we understand, has become, has always been to some degree a kind of a foreign policy backwater for the United States. But I think that's changing over time, and I think it's important to understand that a lot of the actors that we deal with in other parts of the world, in the Middle East, Europe, Asia, are starting to understand that a huge universe vulnerability exists between in our southern hemisphere, and they're starting to act quite extensively in that domain. This diagram, what it essentially does is paints a tier structure of how the direct threats of non-state actors, Hezbollah, drug cartels, transnational crime, has connections, particularly in the threat finance domain, all the way up to what I call shadow state-to-state sponsors, which is how China and Iran and Russia operate. They don't have direct footprint. They try not to have direct footprints in what they do, but they definitely are connected. And then I'll talk a little bit about Iran, because I think that's the topic, at least of the day, in Argentina. And then I'll end with this. Iran, just like these other actors, started to understand that Argentina is a big, vulnerable, weak spot. And Iran's campaign for global legitimacy, they understand very highly that they need to whitewash their implication in the Ami attack. The Ami attack is probably one of the most high-profile terrorist attacks that they're implicated in, and it's one of the ones that is consistently being reminded to them by the work of Dr. Nisman and others. And if they were going to make a case to say that they're, looking for nuclear power for peaceful purposes, or they're trying to become a legitimate nation state in the Middle East, in other words, they need to understand that they need to convince the world that they're not sponsoring terrorism. The AMIA holds them back. Dr. Nisman knew this, and I believe his latest work, especially the case that he put forth in front of the Argentine judiciary, implicating the Argentine president, Cristina Kirchner, in a criminal conspiracy. To me, what that was a strategic shift of the AMIA case, which had historically been a case adjudicated under Argentina's anti-terror laws, into a criminal case that can now be adjudicated under a higher court, perhaps an international court, where now he's going to use, because the gridlock of the whole AMIA case had been not that there hasn't been enough investigation. He knew, he had 700 pages of an indictment against 7 Iranian individuals that knew exactly who did this attack, down to the minute and day that they made the order. What he had the problem was these Interpol red notices, because the way Interpol works, the only way that the Iranians were going to ever serve justice was that the Iranian government had to detain their accused, send them to Interpol for custody, and then send back to Argentina for extradition. That was never going to happen. He knew that. That was the gridlock. He said, so what my understanding of what he was trying to do was use an extradition, more like a subpoena. If he was to bring a criminal case against the president and through a different court, through a third-party court, the Iranians would now be served as witnesses, not as the indicted. And they would have to present all the AMIA evidence before this higher court, and that could have served a lot of international embarrassment to Iran at a time when they're trying to convince the world that they're legitimate. That to me is at the heart of what Nisman was trying to do. He was knowing his work, knowing the individual, he was laser focused on Iran. He knew who in Iran he needed to go after. And I think he was getting closer to this, and perhaps is why he is now dead. So with that, I will end and open to any questions.
Thanks very much, Joseph. That was quite an overview. Loads of questions, I think, probably come to mind for everyone on several of the different topics that you brought up. But if I might just start, perhaps, I myself would have several questions, but let's go to Argentina's nuclear program, if you would. Some time back, prior to the 1990s, I think both Argentina and Brazil had an incipient nuclear and perhaps nuclear weapons program, and Iran actually was assisting Argentina with that. Do you see the possibility now, as Argentina under the Kirchners opens back up again, or not again, but seeks to reestablish these ties with Iran, indeed what Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner is under indictment for, seeking to conclude a kind of a trade agreement with Iran in return for covering up the Iranian role in the AMIA bombing. Do you see perhaps that coordination coming back to turn Argentina's nuclear program back in the direction of a nuclear weapons program? Is that possible?
Possible, yes. This is the way I understand it. So you're correct, Claire, in understanding that Argentina did have a nuclear weapons program early in the 70s. They were a signer of the NPT, Non-Proliferation Treaty. They also signed an agreement with Brazil to say we're no longer going to pursue this program. This is actually, according to Dr. Nisman, one of the reasons they got bombed in the 90s, because he said that when they had a sharing agreement where they were able to use certain facilities for Iranian scientists to come and do their research offshore from the Middle East. And the reason that Iran was very upset with Argentina, and that might have led to the Amia bombing, was the fact that Argentina reneged on that deal. Since then, their nuclear program has been dormant. It's really just in the last 5 years that it started to come up again because it needed money, it needed financing. And it was been Russia and China had been financing the program. I don't know if Argentina itself is really looking to become a major player in the nuclear game. As I said, I pay special attention to Bolivia because Bolivia has certain conditions. I'm not a nuclear scientist, so I can't tell you how all this works, but has certain geographic conditions with their location that I think makes it more conducive for A, to hide that kind of a program, and B, to develop it. But I know that they have, Argentina has a significant capacity in training because their technology and their science and just their ability of the engineers that they have in the country are highly more advanced than most of Latin America, even more advanced in some parts of the Middle East. Back in those days, there was actually Argentina that was helping Iran understand certain parts of how to develop nuclear technology. And that center that I was telling you about in Bariloche has become a hub where you see Bolivians, Venezuelans, Chinese, Russians, Iranians all coming in and getting I don't know what happens there, but I know that they're doing something and it has related to nuclear technology.
Thank you. Right, okay. Thank you very much. Dan, a question?
Thank you. This is a very interesting presentation. Really, two related questions. I always think of the Argentines as ultra-nationalistic, and some of their foreign policy comes from, historic anti-Americanism due to what they viewed as our attempt at hegemony down there. How do the people who are opposed to the United States and on the side of the president, how do they justify submerging their nationalism in making a deal that would be so humiliating that they would agree not to find out who blew up a building in their country and killed Argentine citizens? And the other question is, just really quickly, who is more likely suspect in the death of the prosecutor, the Iranians or indigenous Argentines?
Yeah. The first question, it's a good point. I mean, there's a lot of movements in Argentina that are under the illusion that Argentina is still in control of the Kirchners and their government. They don't. I travel to Argentina somewhat frequently, at least a couple times a year, and having them understand the level of Iranian influence in their country is a foreign concept. They can't, even if I tell them, they don't grasp it. That's the Iranian. The one that really influenced the trajectory of Argentine policy in history, at least in the recent years, is actually Venezuela. Venezuela had an inordinate amount of influence. I just mentioned $10 billion that they bought in Argentina. They won't even accept that because of their nationalist sentiments. They say, no, it's not true, we don't believe it. I think reality is starting to show otherwise. Some of these movements that are on the grassroots level don't have access to don't know what goes on the higher level. On the higher level, I think what happens is some of them just, necessity takes over. When you can't, get enough energy to basically move from one month to the next to have all your federal buildings supplied, I mean, that becomes a general crisis. When you can't pay your pensions to federal workers, that becomes a huge problem. Any one of those triggers could spark a national revolution to some degree, a protest. They had one a couple of times a few years ago for economic reasons, and they're on the verge of having another one this year as well. So in order to maintain power, they're trying to find money wherever they can get it. And the pragmatism of actually surviving becomes stronger than any type of national sentiment at the high level. The grassroots, they just try to deny, and make them not believe. On to the second question about so there's, I say three hypotheses maybe on to Nisman's murder. The first is fell flat on its face. No one believes it. I believe no one in this room would take it seriously. It's a suicide. The first couple of days, I didn't see they were pushing that hard. It had no evidence to back it up. The second is that the Kirchner or her cronies killed Nisman. There's definitely a motive there. I mean, she was the one indicted against in the recent criminal case. I don't know if that's the strongest motive, and I don't know if she's would have been able to do something like that on her own. She has a lot of enemies within the Argentine intelligence. She has some allies as well, but I don't know if she has control over her country to the degree she once did to be able to carry out such a sophisticated political assassination. And then the last are the Iranians, and that's probably the theory that I prescribe to. And you guys probably more about Iran than I do as far as their history of political assassinations. But I'd say take to note this: Nisman, in a televised interview his last televised interview, about a week before he was supposed to appear before Congress, he made it known, kind of by accident, but he made it known that he had found a way to take Iran to an international court. I don't think it's the ICC, I think it's another court. And he said, I'm not going to reveal everything right now because this is what I'm going to talk about on Monday. He said, but I have found a way for the Iranians to face justice. If the Iranians believe that, if they truly believe that he came closer to actually, presenting this case before some type of international community or court, I think they might have acted to prevent that from happening. Argentina's intelligence, and what Nisman was discovering was Argentine intelligence had been compromised by the IRGC. There were at least 12 agents that were working on behalf of Iran within the Argentine intelligence services. Nisman had uncovered a few of those and named only one that I've seen in his reporting, but I understand he knew about a lot more. So that could have been one of the areas that might have been able to get after him.
All right, any more? Ginny?
Could you talk about the ambassador from the U.S. to Venezuela and that person's background, and what role has the Obama team played? How much leverage have they used that they could use to get at the truth at what you're talking about?
Sure. I don't have the full background of the current U.S. ambassador, other than I know that is not the most qualified ambassador in the terms of, doesn't have a long history in the foreign service or doesn't have a political history with Latin America, doesn't speak Spanish. I mean, there's a lot of list that goes on that just on the surface you would say that, might not be the right appointment for, maybe for like, a smaller country, maybe Uruguay or something, but for an important country that's in an important point in their history, Argentina, it's probably a very risky appointment. That said, I think Obama has had I couldn't tell if he had a policy on Argentina or not. I had never seen him really talk about or do much, or the U.S. embassy was there, but there's many U.S. embassies in Latin America that they're there. And a lot of embassies that I visited always gave me the sensation that they were in this region or in this country before a lot of this populist movements, and they'll be there after. So I think they have a kind of a waiting strategy just to kind of wait it out, and it hasn't worked too well, which is peculiar why he started with Cuba when he started to re-engage with Latin America, because that would have been the last place I would have started with. Just a final point on that. One thing that I have been hearing, and I don't know that much about it, but with the Nisman death, I got a lot of calls from reporters, good mainstream press that usually doesn't focus on Argentina, perhaps Washington Post was one of them, and they were looking at an angle that some of you may know more about than I do, which is the Clintons angle, because the Clintons had been going to Argentina repeatedly on speaking tours, financed through, I think, prominent businessmen in Argentina, businessmen that have connections to the Kirchners, and they were wondering if any of that connection had any type of influence over the policies in Argentina, or perhaps the potential ramifications for U.S. interests in the region.
Thank you again, Joseph, very much. Great presentation.